well before legalization. And we learned. My background is in boutique agriculture, so I worked for Canada's largest organic winery. We were the largest organic vineyard as well. And so growing up, I was involved in not only grape viticulture but vegetable and fruit production. I'm in an ag primary area, and yeah, we grow a lot of soft fruits like cherries and peaches. We also do apples and pears and whatnot. So I've been a part of agriculture my whole career. Um, and I transitioned to cannabis because it was good money. Pre-legalization, there was not a lot of enforcement of cannabis laws in British Columbia. There was, in the town of 50,000 people I grew up in, there was 5 hydro stores. So there was definitely
Nice.
a high tolerance to cannabis production in British Columbia in the late 90s and early 2000s. And so seeing that that was where kind of the good money was, I moved over to that. And then as soon as there was a medical program, we jumped on board with that. As soon as we had access to it, I should say, because it went the difference between like possibly getting arrested for growing weed and not at all. And then the only criminal stuff that was happening was done by others elsewhere, right? So I was insulated from any kind of law enforcement in that way, and that's I'm just like many, many, many people pre-legalization that were, I thought the laws were unjust. Under Stephen Harper, they had mandatory minimum sentences. That's one of our former prime minister. He enacted mandatory minimum sentences. So if you had 3 drug offenses, you were going to jail for sure, mandatory minimum. And we thought that that was unjust. This is a plant that was helping lots of people, was an exit drug for many other addictions, and
Yeah.
was pretty benign product that nobody had ever been harmed by. So we were flouting these unjust laws, as many um, activists do. And yeah, coming out the other side, or the prime minister after Stephen Harper, Justin Trudeau, we all know famously legalized cannabis, and that's when the floodgates opened, and a lot of groups went running into the market without a true idea of what they were doing. Probably the most common thing that big groups did was they took some scientists and they took a regulatory person and a person from pharma, and then they grabbed some guy that had run like 10 lights in his garage and put him in charge of a big commercial facility, and the products sucked. So there's a number of issues that I've seen in my exposure to big and small companies as far as challenges with cultivation. People think that growing weed is easy, right? Like it grows like a weed. It's a common thing. Oh, it's just like tomatoes. But the reality is, let's use the tomato analogy. Everybody's Everybody buys a tomato plant from the grocery store. They pay like $20 for it. They put it on their deck and they get like a half a pound of tomatoes. So yeah, tomatoes are easy to grow, but you go to a commercial tomato glass house and they have the things so dialed in that they're doing 5 times the yield they were 20 years ago. They get like 100 kilos of tomatoes per square meter annually. So it's a little different than that shitty cocktail tomato on your deck, right? So the difference between plants surviving and plants thriving is the business of horticulture. We can't just have plants struggling. The quality isn't there, the quantity isn't there. It doesn't produce a viable going concern of a business, right? So that's one of the biggest things is that thinking that it's easy, especially indoors, like indoors is actually hard. Like you have to have all this suite of equipment, all these to be dialed in perfectly, spec to the right size, and things can fall off the rails fast indoors. Plants thrive outdoors. If you have the right climate, it's kind of easy to grow plants out there. Even a greenhouse, it's a more natural environment where the spectrum of light as well as the temperatures are regulated a little bit more naturally. The day and nighttime temperatures, you get that differential naturally. So things are easier to manage in those types of environments than in a high tech indoor where maybe somebody doesn't quite understand the equipment. And that I would say is the biggest failure of these companies is they get growers that are academics that don't understand equipment. I've seen it time and time again. They don't understand the coordination between all of the different assets, HVAC, humidification, lighting, heat, cooling, irrigation, and all of the interconnectivity of those utilities is the biggest issue. Yeah, I could go into one specific example that I'm actually cleaning up the mess of right now. This group, I helped them design a facility. We onboarded a bunch of great equipment. We got it all installed. And then we hired the grower who came from academia. He actually had a number of cannabis companies that he'd worked for. In hindsight, the fact that he had only ever worked for one of these companies for like 6 to 8 months should have been a red flag. But he just was a total gong show. He was a failure because the number one thing he did wrong was he set the deadband on the chillers to 1 degree Celsius. So the compressors were kicking on and off at a 1 degree tolerance all day long for a year and a half. It was
Wow.
causing such a hard short cycling of the compressors that they ended up losing a rooftop unit. A $40,000 10-ton rooftop unit exploded,
Wow.
almost started a fire. And he was blaming that it wasn't the right equipment, wasn't the right equipment, wasn't the right equipment. He was getting dismal yields. He was getting 5 kilos from rooms that should have been pumping 20 to 25 to 30 kilos out of them. And he blamed me actually as the guy who spec'd the equipment. So the company hired me. When they dismissed him, they said, Jeff, why don't you come take care of this, fix this, get this going on. We need your insights. And the first thing I did is I asked him, can I log into your climate computer so I could take a look at what's happening over there? And the guy didn't even know how to do that. So I was
Huh.
like, oh, you've been running this show for a year and a half and you haven't even been looking at the climate on your phone? Wow, that's a bad sign.
And this
And
is
then as soon as I
insane.
this is insane. And so then, and this guy's an academic, right? He's got a
Wow.
degree in horticulture. He's supposed to be an authority in the space. He's all over LinkedIn. He's just is nonstop out there producing content, flouting how amazing of a grower he is. But yeah, he couldn't run a 200 square meter indoor very well. So when I got onboarded, the first thing I did was open up the climate computer, noticed the failure. I saw the graph was like up down. It was very sharp, the curves in the graph, because it was going from heat to cool. Like 1 degree means as soon as it hit that cold point, it was kicking onto heat and then cold and then heat. So, anyways,
Oh
as soon as
man.
I set it to 2 to 3 degrees, I actually run it at 3 degrees now. The graph in within 5 hours smoothed out, the climate regulated, and we could finally start growing some dank weed. And so, within like one day, I corrected the climate. I thankfully I got to start with no plants in the building, so I wasn't adopting any of his fucking problems. But from what I hear before, it was just nothing but insects and fungus and small yields. And I mean, I saw the product, and it was not like I wouldn't smoke it. If I'm a
Huh.
grower, it's kind of like a chef. Like if you wouldn't put it on the plate, or sorry, if you wouldn't put it in your mouth, you don't put it on the plate, right? Like that's just you don't do that. And unfortunately, this group used that initial crops to launch their brand. So that's another big
Wow.
mistake. When you're a new
That's
company, don't put out mediocre product to launch your brand unless it's a value brand. If you're going to be some prestige brand and charge top dollar, don't come up short with quality initially, because it's cliche, but you only get one chance to make a first impression, right? And so we're going
straight
to have
up.
to do a lot of repair to get this brand back online. And so, I mean, academics are great in institutional environments, but in private ventures, they can act as advisors, but I highly recommend making sure that somebody has some operational abilities before you hire an academic to run your agricultural facility. I know a number of them, PhDs are really great, they've got skills, but there's also, there's an old saying like those who can't do and those who can't teach. And this is exactly
Yeah.
one of those guys. He was an educator. He had, he went to Niagara College, I think, and he used to be a high school teacher, and yeah, he's just this authority that couldn't pull it off. So the equipment part of it, that 1 degree deadband, that was just one part of it. Let's talk about this guy's other failings. He was using multiple size containers in one room. How do you
Huh.
dial in your irrigation system if you have more than one size of container in one room that's all on the
Yeah.
same drip system, right? Like that's another one. Like irrigation is how we manage crops, basically, especially in a top feed drip system. The amount and the quantity and the amount of irrigation that you provide per day is really what steers the crop into a generative phase, or keeps it in veg. Or so it's really important that you have a good understanding of what your root zone moisture content is, no matter what your media is, rock wool, cocoa, peat, whatever. So there's a lot of fancy systems out there now, some of which are subscriber based, and there's like an ongoing cost associated with that. But the way we old timers do it is we just weigh the pots. So
Yeah.
if you weigh the pot and then you calibrate it weekly for the amount of biomass that the plant is put on, you get a very good idea of what the wilt weight is, so that when it dries back to a wilt point, and what the saturated or field capacity is. So
Yeah.
that is a major advantage as a tool that I wish I would have known when I was like early 20s, because we also called it the kick the bucket method, right? You kick the bucket, how heavy is it? Do you water or not?
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, there's great, again, there is great sensors, and I am getting into some soil moisture sensors. I'm just not a big fan of subscription services for my grow, because then it's only valuable if I keep paying them big dollars, and it's hard to justify that, man, when we're really talking about something that kitchen scale can do. Um,
Hmm.
I mean, other issues that people have when they set up, it really is just the suite of equipment. So everything's got to be spec to the right load, and the lighting load and the cooling load are very interconnected. Lights basically give out 4 BTUs per watt. So however many watts or kilowatts of lighting that you have in your installation, generally add 10 to 15, 25%, depending on the ambient heat in that area and the building envelope. And then you're good, right? So every BTU that you add, you just take out. Now, what groups where they fail in that is they'll rely too much on other equipment to do it and not dedicated equipment. So like general building HVAC in addition to the lighting load. So just dedicated cooling systems for the lighting loads is integral. And then not only that, but dehumidification is a one that everybody struggles with too. You talk to the companies that make that equipment, and they say, "How much do you irrigate?" Just plan to remove every drop of irrigation that you add to the room, but that's pretty crazy. Like that's a lot of dehumidifiers per space. So we look at it a little bit differently, and we know that our chillers are removing humidity. So what we generally do is we have 50 to 75% of our irrigation load we plan to distill out of the air in a 24-hour period. And then we also put the dehumidifiers on a duty cycle so that they ramp up an hour before lights off. That way you're really primed those compressors to be warm and producing good distillate. And then when the lights turn off, the chillers turn off, so the humidity generally rises. That way, the dehumidifiers are primed to not see a big spike of humidity at the end of lights off. I have often looked at people's
Hmm.
climate computers and their graphs and seen that big. They wonder, why do we? One group in our area, they engaged me and they said, we have penicillin, so it's not botrytis. We have penicillin. We had it tested. It's in our ducts. The stuff is everywhere. How do we get rid of it? How is this happening? Why is it? The reality is that funguses like botrytis or penicillin and yeasts, they're everywhere. They're in the air we breathe around us, right? So you're never going to eliminate all um, fungus from the air. But what you can do is mitigate it from harming the crop by keeping the environment in a proper BPD. So by priming your dehumidifiers so that they don't spike the humidity at the end of the photo period is one great way to do it. Another way you can do it is just plan to put an exhaust fan on a duty cycle as well to just exchange that air. If you don't have the load to remove it, just pull it from outside. But that comes at a different cost of smell and a nuisance to the neighbors and whatnot. But we're in a very dry climate here, so we have that ability. We grow, like I said, soft fruits, so it's a really dry climate, and we have the ability to just vent air when needed. And that's actually why greenhouses do so well here, is that the climate is like ideal. Maybe
I've
a
got a
little
quick
warm though.
question for you, Jeff, related to something you mentioned earlier. It might not be something that I actually know, hence why I'm asking. What
Okay.
was the relationship between soil moisture content and the plant staying in veg or not?
Yeah.
I.e., tell
Yeah.
me about that.
So what basically when the water content of the media is kept higher, so our rule of thumb, which I don't like that term, but our standard is a better term for it, is that when
Mhm.
the media gets to 75% moisture content in veg, we reapply irrigation. But in flower, we allow it to dry to 50, even 45 or 40% moisture content before reapplying. Um, and that's
Okay.
because when the plants are moister, they tend to just stay in veg. And that little
Mm.
bit of drought stress, it helps promote the plant to go into a generative phase. And that's not just cannabis, by the way. The same um, techniques are used in vine cropping, like cucumber and tomato. So it's
Yeah.
that it's not even a drought stress. I'm not talking about like to a wilt point. just
Yeah.
allowing the media to dry out, there's a hormonal response within the plant that triggers it to go generative, because it's like they can tell it's summer, or they can tell that there's that little bit of stress means, oh, we got to reproduce. Now, when you go,
That's
if you have
interesting because
yeah,
I'm just giving my plants in the polytunnel their first extended dry period now. It's not, I wouldn't call it so much a dry period, but an extended, well, the longest amount of time so far, I've not given them any water. So, yeah, it's just like piqued my interest.
and another way to think about it is that when the photo period is reduced, the water demand on the crop
Yeah,
is
yeah,
50% what it was.
yeah.
So you can knock well, it's not even, it's like a two-thirds of what it was. So you can knock a third of water off. And then if you take it down to 50% of the amount of water that the crop is using, at that stress response helps trigger the flower. It reduces the transition period from vegetative to generative growth. And it also, once you're into that bulking phase, the plants tend to bulk up faster. So we use a higher EC and a higher volume of water in veg. And then as we switch to generative, the EC lowers and the NPK ratio obviously changes. We tend to do more like P and K and less N in the flower,
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
and then really more K near the end. So
Hmm.
it's a combination between water content and mineral constituents that really drive big flowers. And I've been like I consider myself kind of a knowledgeable person in the space, but that's because I've made all the mistakes, right? Like I didn't start
Yeah.
with big glass houses and big greenhouses. No, we started in a basement, man. And then that basement turned into multiple basements. And then that multiple basements, when we got medical license, turned into warehouses. And then that turned into a warehouse in Oakland and a greenhouse in Palm Springs. And then, a facility in Washington. And I moved around and worked for a bunch of different groups and was exposed to a lot of different techniques and experts, vegetable growers, flower growers, Dutch flower growers. Man, they may not know weed, but they sure know plant science. And
Hmm.
from a a practical perspective, right? Because when you're growing cut flowers or bedding plants at scale, the margins are razor thin. So and the Dutch are notoriously cheap. They're almost as cheap as my Scottish grandparents, right? So they don't spend a dollar if they can avoid it. And
That
that
is
is
true.
kind of how we're going to be competitive in the future of cannabis business. Is it's not like the days of raising millions of dollars and spending it on executive bonuses and blowing it on like features and facilities that we don't need is over. All that money has been spent. And now we got to like look at this from a more of an agricultural perspective, like where my roots are, which is keep it simple, stupid, right? I have done a lot of organic horticulture, but I'm currently running a hydroponic system, and it is different. The product is different, but the ease of use, it's a local indigenous group that runs the facility. So we're starting with the really simple, and we're going to evolve over the next couple of years to add some more organic elements to make it a little bit more not only eco-friendly, but just a little bit more dynamic flavor profiles. I find that the straight, like certified organic, it has a more rich kind of mouth feel, and the products are a little bit more complex. So
Yeah.
we'll get there. Not to say you can't grow fireweed hydroponically. It's just it's
No.
not quite as dynamic in our experience.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Cool. So, you've been growing some skunk haze. I've been interested to hear about how you found those, bro.
Yeah, so we're gonna like I just popped them, and what our plan is, because we don't know how many phenotypes there is, we're gonna do one tray